We're going to be talking a little bit about the Galileo affair, and we're not talking about the episode from Star Trek, but we are actually talking about the fact that the whole issue with Galileo seems to be used against the church many times in an attempt to show how unscientific the church tended to be. So let's talk about the evidence of God's existence and Galileo. You want to get us started?
Sure, maybe I'll just start with Galileo, and we can get into the evidence of God's existence in the contemporary era from science a little bit later. But just, to straighten out the historical case with respect to Galileo, the first thing I think we need to note is that the church was never against the heliocentric universe, and certainly was not against the natural sciences. If you go back to my program from a couple of weeks ago, I talked about four, priests who were very much involved in the forefront of the natural sciences, including Father Georges Lemaitre, who discovered the Big Bang Theory, Gregor Mendel, of course, who was the father of quantitative genetics, but also was an abbot and an Augustinian monk. And then we talked about Nicholas Steno, who of course was a bishop, a Catholic Danish bishop. And we talked about Nicholas Copernicus, who was the first person to have discovered and mathematically made probable or even possible the heliocentric solar system. Now that was a huge development, and the church, by the way, Nicholas Copernicus was a Catholic cleric. He had minor orders and was a canon lawyer, and of course, the Pope Paul III was the person to whom Nicholas Copernicus dedicated his book on the heliocentric solar system and the mathematical evidence for its possibility. So the church was never against the heliocentric universe, certainly not against the natural sciences, always in the forefront of the natural sciences. So that wasn't the issue with respect to Galileo. The issue really comes down to this. Galileo, as you know, it was using a telescope. He discovered some lunar orbits around Jupiter, and he had a hunch, basically, and that's all there was a hunch that maybe the solar system followed the patterns of the moons around Jupiter, our moon around the Earth, and so forth, that maybe the Earth was going around the sun, that Jupiter and the other planets were also going around the sun in this heliocentric system, and that the Earth was not at the center of the solar system. Now, of course, as I said before, Nicholas Copernicus had already made this possible. The Catholic Church had already accepted it as a possibility. Now, the interesting thing was, when Galileo put this forward, he worked with the Jesuits at the Roman College, and the Jesuits at the Roman College, by the way, helped Galileo to formulate the mathematics to show this. But there was one requirement, and it's the same requirement we have today for the natural sciences. Namely, you have to have observational evidence for the theory to back it up. Now, of course, today we have peer-reviewed journals. So if you come up with a theory, but you don't have the evidence from observation, the evidence from the natural world around you, then of course the peer-reviewed journal will simply say, "Hey, we can't accept this article. It's not a scientific fact." You can't proclaim something to be a scientific fact. You can't say that it's proved before you have the observational evidence in. Now, the interesting thing was that Pope Urban VIII, who was frankly a very good friend of Galileo's.
Right, that's what I understand.
In fact, himself was.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly
that's right. He was a mathematician, and like the Jesuits at the Roman College, was a very good friend of Galileo. He told Galileo and made him promise that he would not publish the heliocentric solar system as a fact until there was evidence, observational evidence to prove it. And as I said before, you know, the same thing would be required of Galileo today by any peer-reviewed scientific journal. And in fact, if Galileo did what he did to the Pope, you know, a scientific journal today would make him retract it. In other words, claim that something was a fact without the observational evidence to prove it. But that's all the Pope asked him to do. Respect the rules of observational evidence until you get stellar parallax. And stellar parallax, just simply, it's a technique that means that we can judge by the movement of the stars relative to one another, more distant stars relative to nearer stars. We can make a judgment whether the Earth is rotating around or orbiting around the Sun, or the Sun is orbiting around the Earth. We can tell very definitively. Here's the problem with stellar parallax: those movements and relative movements of the distant stars relative to the nearer ones are very, very slight perturbations. You need very precise astronomical instruments in order to get it. But the technique is called stellar parallax. It can be measured, but at the time of Galileo, the instruments were very crude. I mean, basically, Galileo took essentially a Dutch spyglass, and you know, that was used for naval purposes, and adapted it for astronomical observations, as did many others, including Johannes Kepler. But the main thing was, it was very crude still. They didn't have, you know, really precise instrumentation. So stellar parallax actually seemed to suggest at the time that the geocentric solar system was correct. That's where observational evidence seemed to suggest. But in point of fact, you know, Galileo, instead of waiting until he had all the evidence in, instead of waiting until he could make an observational claim, he went ahead and he publishes in the what's called the two New World systems, right? And he actually puts a very adverse opinion, mocking his friend Pope Urban VIII, right? In essentially calling him Simplicius, right, which means basically a fool or a simpleton. He puts the words of the Pope in the mouth of Simplicius. And of course, once Urban VIII thinks he has been mocked, right, and then on top of it, right, Galileo has gone back on the promise that he made to Urban VIII. He promised he wouldn't do it without the observational evidence, went ahead and did it. And I mean, to talk about sinning boldly, he certainly sinned boldly and mocked the Pope while he was doing it. This really got you know, Pope Urban VIII upset. And here's, you know, I just to give a contemporary analogy to this, right? You know, today we wouldn't view this, okay, so you kind of mock the Pope and and so forth.
There's a lot of mocking that goes on in the world today, so especially even of the Pope,
exactly.
So not unusual.
That's right. So that's right. But in those days, this would be like publishing this in a scientific tractate and not having the evidence in, and of course having to get a forced retraction because you didn't do what was required scientifically. And Galileo didn't do what was required scientifically. Today, his publication would have been rejected by any peer-reviewed scientific journal because he didn't have the evidence.
Okay, Father, let's stop you there, because I think you've given us a lot to think about in the sense of understanding the relationship between the Pope, Galileo, and I think a couple important points you made about the idea of a theory versus it being provable.